I call Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. As much as it pains me to stand up in defence of government legislation, and it does pain me, sir, it does. But just in response to what the Green Party member was just talking about, she was assigning a kind of a personality or a proclivity to what are generic fund investment tools. They're simply a mechanism for purchasing and the management of investments. And what the Greens have insinuated in their contribution this evening is to suggest that they in and of themselves allow and contribute to tax havens or tax evasion. And unfortunately, that is just simply not the case. Well, fortunately, as the case may be, because New Zealand First absolutely supports this legislation, because we did take note of what they had said in their previous contributions around tax havens and tax avoidance. So I did spend a lot of time investigating the inference that they raised, and the reality is it is only an inference. There is examples of FIVs being used unjudiciously and inappropriately, but that does not make them bad tools in and of themselves, and used well by our guardians in this legislation. New Zealand First is absolutely confident, sir, that they are absolutely the right tool to be used in terms of moving forward. So, but I just want to now just address some of the statements from the Minister. I just want to agree with him in the main, because the very first thing he said was, it's taken us a really long time to get here. And it's, yeah, yeah, true. It's taken the National Party a really long time to get here, and I can't understand it. You've had consistent support from the opposition parties right from the start. No, it is not a busy government, Mr. Bishop. And he pointed out, and again, I'll come to this in the body of my speech, my contribution, that the government must maintain its independence, or politicians must remain removed and ring-fenced from the decision-making of this fund in particular. And well, Mr. Bennett is an expert in his contributions to the House, and I do enjoy listening to those contributions. But originally, it was suggested that the Minister have the right to intervene, and New Zealand First asked the question, is that necessarily appropriate? And it was great to see the Minister himself actually come back and say, well, probably not to our querying, I have to admit, but in response to the general outcry, actually it's not appropriate. We do need to remove this provision for the Minister to intervene into the super fund. The issue here is what we've been seeing, and until we pass this bill, the Guardians themselves have been restricted in what they can do. They've said it themselves, and I'll provide some detail very shortly. But what we like in this legislation, what New Zealand First likes, I should more appropriately say, is it does give the Guardians, sir, an ability to make decisions around investing in New Zealand business. And so for us, particularly when you have this premier investment fund, to be able to do that is a great, and not just ideologically, but fundamentally for our economy moving forward, an essential device in terms of promoting, enabling investment into this country, Mr. Speaker. The other thing the Minister said was that the FIVs themselves are a tool or a device that provide the Guardians a simple approach, and it will provide flexibilities, for the overseers in reducing costs and allowing for greater returns. So for us, again, for New Zealand First, that makes perfect sense. You reduce your operational cost, you allow the Guardians to get in there, make wise decisions simply and effectively, and in doing so, you allow for greater returns to this fund. And it's not only logical, sir, it's just common sense. So we agree with Mr. English. The less intervention he is into this fund, the better. However, contributing to it has been another issue entirely. And I do think it appropriate to raise in this debate that the national government has in total, in terms of the total contribution in this fund, only contributed 2% of that total contribution. Now that is entirely inappropriate. And the Minister uses, reverse logic that they use to attack Labor on their discussions around the management of the budget, and they use some kind of reverse logic there to insinuate that they've got it backwards. And the Minister's done it the same here, the same with this piece of legislation here. The simple reality is, Mr. Speaker, is that this is a lost opportunity on the part of the national government, and New Zealanders, whether they're retiring now or in the future, have, as a very bottom line, missed out on at least $10 billion in extra funds that would have been there if those contributions had continued. Now, in terms of talking about the detail, the reality is, and I've hinted at it just previously, the legislation allows the Guardians, it basically removes the quite restrictive operating parameters that they are currently under, and it does, and it has restricted their ability to invest, particularly in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand First has always maintained that these funds provide the premier opportunity for good investment into our own country, not only to boost existing businesses, but, Mr. Speaker, to also create, well, that's a tricky word, to enable businesses to become New Zealand businesses, perhaps once again, might be the politically correct way of saying it, without offending Mr. Bishop's ideological principles too much. As I mentioned in my reply to the Minister, this should not and cannot mean direct political intervention. And I would like to acknowledge the fact personally that here is an example of the government actually talking to those stakeholders involved in this decision. So they went and actually talked to the Guardians and said, what's the problem? What's going on? What do you need? And the irony of irony, sir, is that they listened, and we now have this very piece of sensible legislation in front of us. So just to summarise, New Zealand First does support this legislation. It is good, it is sound, and it might be called old school, but it is, the reasoning for it is just because it is common sense. It allows the Guardians to make good decisions using modern investment vehicles, and in our minds will enable greater and more efficient investment into New Zealand, which can only be a good thing in our mind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.